First of all, I'd like to thank Enzo once again for his kindness in inviting me back to this wonderful meeting. It is truly my favorite meeting of the entire year. I thank you for your generosity in inviting me back along with the organizing committee. So we're going to talk about our experience at Devers Eye Institute with preloaded DMEK surgery, results and complications. I've updated this to the first 111 consecutive cases because we now have 111 that are past 6 months, and this is now in publication or pre-publication in the journal Cornea if you would like more information. Let's see if we can move forward. There we go. I have no financial interest in the contents of the presentation, but I'm going to be talking about trypan blue, SF6 gas, and the Strico glass injector. So we all know that the evolution of endothelial keratoplasty has been just remarkable over the last 18 years. And we've seen it progress where we have DLEK. And this case actually is now 16 years out. I did this case back in 2002, and that cornea is still clear 16 years later. And that was not as sophisticated an operation as we have now. And so we have great hope for our current procedures of DSAEK and DMEK that they'll last as long as our DLEKs. Then we see that DSAEK is, everyone's aware, and then there's, of course, DMEK, which is pure anatomic replacement. I'm not going to go over the advantage of DMEK over DSAEK. I think even if you're looking at nano DSAEK, that DMEK still is perfect anatomic replacement. And as I tell my residents and my fellows, I say, you know, God and evolution cannot be wrong. If we can make the eye exactly as it was intended to be, then we are going to get those similar results. But despite all the advantages of DMEK surgery, as you've heard in previous lectures, the adoption by surgeons is pretty poor. Only about 13 to 20%, possibly with this year, of the transplants for EK are DMEK. Well, it was over now 6 or 7 years ago that I wrote the editorial in Cornea, the journal Cornea, asking why aren't we all doing DMEK? If we know there's advantages for the patient, why aren't we doing DMEK? And many of the surgeons would tell me it's because of all the work that you have to do before you actually put the tissue inside the eye. And even the beginning days of DMEK, where the surgeons were all stripping their own tissue, there was always a danger of destroying the tissue. There was a danger of having the tissue upside down and not knowing it, and so the different methods of determining orientation, like the S-stamp and the peripheral cutting of tissue to give you better orientation, were enacted. The surgeon still had to trephinate and stain and load the tissue, and all of these stages can present damage to the tissue and risk of so much damage that you could even lose the graft. And so this is scary for a surgeon to get to the point of surgery, and with all the financial costs that we've talked about in the previous session, to not be able to do your operation is a terrible thing. So the main concerns of the surgeons were, as we discussed, the stripping, the trephinating, the loading, the unscrolling, and not knowing the tissue was right side up, and then the increased costs of the trypan blue, the Trefine, and the injector in the operating room. So most surgeons' perspective is that they would agree that yes, DMEK is better, but it's not fast, it's not easier, and it's not faster. So there's not just been an evolution in corneal transplantation techniques by the surgeon, but there's been an evolution in eye banking that has accompanied this in order to always make it easier for the surgeon. And so the steps that were previously done by the surgeon are now done by technicians. There's now pre-stripped tissue that is readily available and has been universally accepted in the United States. There are S stamps and F stamps and other types of markings that can be done that are provided by the eye bank to take away the danger of ever having an upside down graft. Tissue is pre-stained and pre-trephinated now in the talk that I'm presenting, and it's also now preloaded into the modified Jones tube, which I call the Strico injector because it's all Mike's work. So patient-ready tissue from the eye bank is what you saw with a previous presentation by Dr. Strico. Let me show you how this works with a video. Do we have sound on this? Can we raise the sound? I'm going to have to talk about this. So basically, this comes to you in the standard crawler container. You lift it out with a hemostat. The tissue, as you can see, is beautifully situated in the glass tube. And we grab it with your fingers, load it onto a syringe that has a coupler. This coupler tubing is a 14 French gastric tubing. It's about a 15 millimeter length. And you just put it onto a standard 3 cc syringe. Now this is a Petri dish that is got BSS, and you see I'm ejecting some of the Optisol. I'm trying to avoid having the Optisol go into the eye. It's not a big worry. I just don't want to have the dextran in the eye if I can avoid it. And then we simply go to the table and we inject it into the eye. But notice this tissue was prepared for me 2 days before. And look at the color. It's deep blue after 2 days in a Strico injector in Optisol. And then we just, this is a pretty standard technique. We always have the pupil constricted, by the way. I think it's a danger to have a large pupil with the IOL ability to touch the endothelial layer. So we always have the smallest pupil we possibly can. And then we just simply tap it out. We guard the wound as we're coming out with the injector. Always guard the wound, and then we remove it, and then we just tap this out as usual. Okay, I'm hoping I can get sound for the next couple videos. Hello? Can we have sound for the next couple videos? Okay. So let me just first mention some unique aspects of using preloaded tissue. You need to specify in advance to the eye bank what diameter size you want for the donor tissue. The default size that I've just specified for my eye bank is a 7.75 millimeter size, because I strip an 8 millimeter recipient bed, and we like to put it in a 7.75, slightly smaller, and it fits just perfectly. If you have a smaller eye, you should request a smaller size. If a larger eye, larger size if you want. But 99% of my cases are an 8 millimeter strip. You need to also request a piece of donor rim if you want to perform donor tissue cultures, because obviously there's nothing, if you just get the pre-stripped tissue and you want a culture to look for the possibility of a post-operative Candida infection or something, you need to have the donor rim, and they can send that to you, but they won't do it automatically unless you live in New York. You cannot determine the endothelial cell death by the trypan blue, and the method we were using before the preloaded, I would put trypan blue on the tissue before finishing off the strip. And during that time that it was staining for 30 or 40 seconds, I could see how much endothelial damage there was to the endothelium before I would load the tissue up myself. And now you can't do that. The eye bank does an endothelial cell count for you before they ship the tissue to you, so you know the quality of the tissue on that. One interesting thing is the tissue can stick to the wall of the injector, and this happens about 10% of the time. And so you need to irrigate the tissue off of the wall of the injector, and you simply take a BSS cannula, go through the distal tip of the injector after you've loaded it onto the syringe, and you give a short spurt of BSS, and that will allow the tissue then to be separated from the wall of the injector. And I'm sure that there's cell death wherever the tissue is attached to the wall. And then it's the need to remove that distal Optisol. We use Optisol cold storage solution. Here in Italy, you use organ culture media. I don't know if it's necessary to remove the Optisol or not, so I do, but it's not worth the cost of the risk of ejecting the tissue into the Petri dish. So I think just simply doing what you can on that is reasonable. Now, before we started clinically using preloaded tissue, this was totally validated by the eye bank with extensive research in the laboratory to see all of the concerns. How long can the tissue be stored in the injector before it incurs damage? How long can it be in cold storage? And we have 2 papers that we published on this, and with vital dye staining and Fiji analysis of cell death over the entire tissue. We found that if you store the tissue for 5 days in the tube, you have about 13% cell loss from just the storage. But what was most amazing to us, and this is to our advantage, is the trypan blue stain was intense even after 5 days of storage. But I wanted further validation on what can we do with this tissue. It's different if it's going to be shipped to me just across the city. But what if this is going to be shipped to New York? Or what if this is going to be shipped to Italy or to Japan? What's going to happen in that shipping box? Because sometimes I'll get a box from UPS or FedEx, and the box is dented, and the box is all, just a terrible shape. I thought, what's going to happen to this little glass tube holding that precious tissue? And it's in this box, and it's shipped over to New York, and sometimes New York shipping people aren't so kind. So what about extreme shipping? So I told the eye bank, and this is going to be kind of fun, I hope. I told the eye bank, I need a gorilla test. I need to see if this tissue can hold up inside this box. So if you remember 1976, there was a commercial about American Tourister luggage. And they tried to make sure that this $20. Okay, so what if there was tissue inside that American Tourister luggage? Well, I said, let's test our method of shipping. I didn't have a gorilla, but I did have some tests. So there's tissue inside this box. Oh my gosh, he dropped the box. It's gone down the stairs. It has 4 containers in it of precious donor tissue. So that's not really a gorilla test. What about a disgruntled employee, an angry employee that was just fired? An evil smile. So this is the second test. How would that tissue inside that box do? And then finally, if you really want to test what happens in shipping, how about the rooftop drop? There it goes. Boom. In slow motion, it's even more impressive. So there's 4 tissues that have been loaded up into little injectors, glass injectors. How do they do with those tests? This is actually a 4th test. We did another one that was fun. How do those tissues look after all this gorilla? This is tissue 1, and what you can see is that there's little cavitation bubbles in the solution, but when you take off the cap of the carrier, those bubbles are gone. So it's all in the solution. And the tissue is still dead center where it was left. And it comes out, and the tip of the tube is not broken. Nothing's broken. That's tissue 1. Same thing with tissue 2. Same thing with tissue 3. Same thing with tissue 4. And so I think the gorilla test was one that assured me that if we send this tissue overseas and it has horrible handling, it still will be fine from a physical standpoint. It will be fine for you, just as if it were shipped across city to me. Okay, so let's get on to the results. This is actually not the fun part. This is straightforward. 111 eyes. These are consecutive eyes. The primary graft failure rate was 0. The rebubble rate was 14%, and this is higher than our prior experience. The endothelial cell loss at 3 months was 27%, at 6 months was 31%, and this is the same as our prior studies on non-preloaded tissue. We measure how tight the tissue was scrolled, and it was 2.2 on a scale of 1 to 4, 4 being very tightly scrolled, 1 being loosely scrolled, and this was no different than our prior experience. But what's interesting is the time to unscroll the tissue was 3.4 minutes, about half the time from our prior experience. If we look at the, endothelial cell loss, once again, on some more detail, we can see that there is a cell loss initially. It seems to start to flatten out. And on the rebubbles, they were between 3 and 26 days post-op, and there were 2 eyes that received 2 rebubbles. The storage time, we increased storage time, did not increase the rebubble rate. We had 88 donors that were stored for 1 day, 15 cases had a rebubble. 23 eyes were stored for 2 days, and 1 case had a rebubble. The endothelial cell loss at 6 months was 4%, a range was anywhere from 4% gain of cells to an 80% cell loss. So a large range, just as we've seen in our previous studies. Well, I think the advantage of the preloaded DMEK is it does save time in the operating room. There's no trepiding, no finishing off the stripping, no 4 minutes of staining, no loading of the tissue in the injector. It saves the direct cost of the operating facility, so you don't have to pay for the trypan blue and the other supplies. But as you saw in the previous session, the costs, as the sophistication of the preparation tissue goes up, the cost of the processing fees goes up as well. And although we're lucky that it's a pass-through in the United States, just as the pre-strip tissues were in the pre-cut for DSAEK, the costs are going up, and this is of concern for everyone. So DMEK's evolved dramatically in the past 3 years. It's now standardized and I think easier. And the eye banks have now stepped up and they significantly reduce the risk, the time, and the direct costs of DMEK surgery. Well, as always, I thank my son Charlie, especially he's been here. I wish he would get rid of his beard and go back to looking like this. My son Nicholas, who's at home, and of course Cindy, who's with me. I thank them for being here with me. I thank you very much for your kind attention. Grazie.